Okay, we're almost ready to start getting our computer to do things for us. As we've said, we want to take that idea of computational thinking, taking a problem and breaking it down into a sequence of mechanical steps that will let us deduce solutions to that problem. And we want to be able to take that description and somehow convert it into a form where the computer can do the work for us. That says we need a way of describing those sequences of steps, and that's where the programming language comes in. Our programming language is going to define both the syntax and the semantics that we need to translate our computational ideas into mechanical steps. Syntax, I'll remind you, says, how do we put together legal expressions? Semantics says, how do we deduce the meanings associated with those expressions, which is going to let us solve the problems that we want. We're almost ready to start talking about a programming language, but we need to make one more choice. And that choice comes down to the kind of programming language. One way to think about this is, no matter which language we use, the interaction with the computer will all be roughly the same. We're going to take an input and provide it to the computer. That's what we call the source code. That input is then going to go through some kind of computational process, and when we're done, we'd like to get a result printed out or returned by the computer over. And right here is where that computational process is going to take place. And we have some choices here in terms of how the computer actually deals with taking our input and reducing it to an output. And let's look at what those choices might say. One choice is that we can use what's called a low-level programming language. Low-level says that the instructions we type in or that we enter into the computer are very similar to the internal control unit we saw last time. Those instructions might be at the level of saying, move data from one location in memory to another, or execute a simple ALU, or arithmetic logic unit operation, like add, subtract, compare. Might also involve jumping to a new point in the sequence of instructions based on that comparison, but the programming would be done in a very low level. Once we make that decision to use this kind of a programming language, then the stages within the computer are pretty straightforward. There is a process called a checker, which takes that low-level code and just confirms that the syntax is correct and that the static semantics are correct. And then it passes that sequence of instructions on to a process called the interpreter that simply follows that sequence, much as we saw last time, ending up with some output that gets printed back out to us. So in a low-level language, we're programming basically at the level of the machine. That's one option. There's a second option, though, which is to use what's called a high-level language. And a high-level language uses more abstract kinds of terms. We might want to talk about having the computer think about invert a matrix, compute a function, compare two complex data structures. We'd like to be able to program, if you like, at the level of thinking about higher kinds of abstractions. Now, here, again, we've got a choice. In a compiled language, those abstractions are then first checked, as they did before, but then converted back into low-level code. So there is a special thing or special process inside the computer called a compiler that takes the checked sequence of instructions and reduces them or converts them back down to those basic computer instructions that we know we need, and those are then run through the interpreter in order to execute the actual process. So this is certainly one way to do it. It's a compiled language. There's an alternative. And the alternative is, again, to have a high-level language, run it through the checker as before, but in an interpreted language, there's a special program that converts that source code to an internal data structure and then sequentially converts each step into low-level machine instructions and executes it. That says we're going to, one instruction at a time, do the conversion and execution. And in this case, this is the kind of language you're going to use. In this course, we're going to use Python, which belongs to this class of interpreted programming languages. Now, you might say, so what are the choices? What are the trade-offs here? And there are a couple of trade-offs. In a compiled language, the code typically is faster because we do all the work ahead of time through the compiler to convert our instructions into the low-level machine instructions. So we can make them very efficient, which means they'll run faster. But one of the challenges is if we have a bug or an error in our code, when the compiled code hits that error, it can often be difficult to figure out what caused it because we're way down in the weeds of those compiled instructions. And figuring out what corresponding point in our actual instructions led to that error can be a challenge. In an interpreted language, it can be a little slower, not badly, but a little slower, because we're doing the conversion on the fly, one instruction at a time. On the other hand, when we do hit an error or a bug, it is usually easier to determine what caused that error because we know exactly at what point in our code we were at when that error occurred. Again, there are trade-offs here. Different people like different versions of languages. For us, we're going to use Python, which has this property of being an interpreted language.